Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight we're walking through the empty corridors of justice after hours, where courthouse janitors clean more than just floors and witness more than just evidence. These halls hold secrets that echo long after the gavel falls, and some confessions were never meant to be heard by the living. Story 1. The confession booth. Marcus had been cleaning the Davidson County Courthouse for 3 years when he first heard the whispers. It was a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of humid Tennessee evening that made the old building's air conditioning work overtime. He'd started his shift at 11 p.m., same as always, methodically working his way through the administrative offices on the 3rd floor, before moving down to the courtrooms. The courthouse was a massive Gothic Revival building from 1887. All dark stone and narrow windows that seemed to watch you as you worked. During the day, it bustled with lawyers, defendants, families, and court officials. But at night, when Marcus pushed his cart through the empty hallways, the building felt different, heavy, like the weight of every verdict rendered. Within its walls still hung in the air. Marcus was a quiet man in his mid-50s who took pride in his work. He'd been laid off from the automotive plant 2 towns over and needed the steady income the county job provided. The work was solitary, which he preferred, and he'd developed an efficient routine that let him finish most nights by 6 a.m. That Tuesday night, he was cleaning courtroom 4 when he first heard them. Voices low and urgent, coming from somewhere near the judge's bench. Marcus stopped mopping and listened, thinking maybe someone had stayed late or forgotten to lock up. But when he looked up from his bucket, the courtroom was empty. Just rows of wooden benches stretching back toward the doors. The voices continued. And as Marcus listened more carefully, he realized they weren't coming from the courtroom itself. They seemed to be emanating from behind the judge's bench, from the small chamber where judges would retire to consider verdicts or meet with attorneys. I didn't mean for it to happen. A man's voice was saying, thick with emotion. She was just supposed to be scared, you know? Just scared enough to drop the case. Marcus set down his mop and moved closer to the bench. The voice was clearer now, desperate and raw. But she fought back, the voice continued. She fought back and I hit her too hard. I never meant to kill her. God, I never meant to kill her. A chill ran down Marcus's spine. He looked around the empty courtroom, trying to locate the source of the confession. The judge's chamber door was closed, and no light showed beneath it. But the voice was coming from that direction, clear as if someone were standing right next to him. 23 years, the voice went on. 23 years I've lived with this. Watching her husband cry at the trial. Watching him age and break and die still thinking it was a random robbery. Watching her daughter grow up without a mother because of what I did. Marcus felt his hands begin to shake. This wasn't possible. The courthouse was empty. He'd checked every room when he started his rounds. The security system would have alerted him to any unauthorized entry. Yet here was this voice, pouring out a confession to a murder that sounded like it happened decades ago. The voice began to sob, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very walls of the building. Sarah Mitchell. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. She was 28 years old, and she was going to testify against my boss for sexual harassment. All I was supposed to do was follow her home, make some noise, break a window. Make her think twice about going to court. Marcus knew that name. Sarah Mitchell. He'd lived in Davidson County his whole life, and that case had been major news when he was in his 20s. A young woman found beaten to death in her home. Her purse stolen, no witnesses. The case had gone cold despite an intensive police investigation, but she recognized me, the voice continued. From the office building where she worked. She saw my face and she knew who sent me. So I had to make sure she couldn't tell anyone. The crying intensified, and Marcus realized he was crying too, tears streaming down his face as he listened to this impossible confession. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands, thinking he should record this somehow, but the screen showed no signal. The courthouse's thick stone walls often interfered with cell service, especially at night. I threw away the weapon in Lake Barkley, the voice said. A crowbar from my truck. It's still down there, 20 feet from the old fishing pier. And I kept her locket. God help me. I kept her locket as some kind of sick reminder. It's in my safe deposit box at First National. Box 247. Marcus was scribbling notes on a napkin from his pocket, his handwriting shaky but legible. This was evidence. This was a confession to a cold case that had haunted the county for over 2 decades. I'm dying, the voice whispered, so quietly Marcus had to strain to hear. Cancer. The doctors say I have maybe 2 weeks. And I can't take this to my grave. Someone needs to know. Someone needs to tell her family the truth. The sobbing stopped abruptly, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Marcus stood there for several minutes, waiting for the voice to return, but heard only the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. He finished cleaning the courtroom in a daze, his mind racing. In the morning, he would call the police. He would tell them about the confession, about the details that matched the case file, about the specific information that only the killer would know. But would anyone believe him? The next evening, Marcus returned to Courtroom 4 at the same time, hoping to hear the voice again. But the room was silent. He cleaned every surface, organized every piece of furniture, hoping to trigger another confession. Nothing. It wasn't until Friday that Marcus saw the obituary in the local paper. Robert Bobby Hendricks, 67, had died Wednesday morning after a battle with pancreatic cancer. Hendricks had been a private investigator for most of his career, often working corporate cases. He was survived by no immediate family. Marcus stared at the obituary photo. The face was familiar, though aged. He'd seen Bobby Hendricks in the courthouse many times over the years, usually accompanying lawyers or sitting in on various proceedings. A man who moved through the legal system like a ghost, always present but rarely noticed. That afternoon, Marcus walked into the Davidson County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak with a detective about the Sarah Mitchell case. He brought his napkin with its cramped notes and told his story to Detective Amy Chun, who listened with skepticism that gradually transformed into intense interest. Lake Barkley, she said, reading from Marcus's notes. Box 247 at First National. These are specific details that weren't released to the public. I know how this sounds, Marcus said. But I heard what I heard. Detective Chun called Lake Barkley's dive team that afternoon. They found the crowbar exactly where the voice had said it would be, 20 feet from the old fishing pier, buried in silt but still recognizable. Forensic analysis would later confirm blood traces that matched Sarah Mitchell's DNA. The bank required a warrant for the safe deposit box, but Bobby Hendricks' death had made him no longer a client. Inside box 247, investigators found a gold locket with Sarah Mitchell's initials and photo, along with newspaper clippings about her murder and a handwritten letter detailing his guilt. The Sarah Mitchell case was officially closed that winter. Her daughter, now in her 40s, finally learned the truth about her mother's death. The revelation brought some measure of peace to a family that had waited 23 years for answers. Marcus continues to work at the courthouse, but he's never heard another confession in Courtroom 4. Sometimes, though, late at night when he's mopping the floors, he feels a presence near the judge's bench. Not threatening, but grateful. Like someone who finally found peace after carrying a terrible burden for decades. He started paying closer attention during his rounds, listening for other voices that might need to be heard. Because Marcus has learned that some truths are so heavy, they can echo through the walls of justice long after the people who carry them have gone silent. Story 2. The Evidence Locker. Carmen Rodriguez had been working the night shift at the Riverside County Superior Court for 6 months when she first noticed the evidence locker. acting strangely. The basement of the courthouse housed decades' worth of case materials, boxes of documents, evidence bags, exhibits that had been entered into various trials over the years. Carmen's job was straightforward. Clean the offices, courtrooms, jury rooms, and public areas. Mop the floors, empty the trash, dust the furniture. The evidence storage area in the basement wasn't part of her regular duties. But sometimes she'd venture down there when she needed to dispose of larger items, or when the main dumpster was full. The basement was a maze of narrow hallways lined with metal shelving units, each section clearly labeled with case numbers and dates. The oldest evidence dated back to the 1970s. Yellowed manila folders and plastic bags that looked ancient under the fluorescent lighting dot. It was during her third month on the job that Carmen first heard the sounds. She'd gone to the basement around 2 a.m. to throw away some broken office furniture, and as she was maneuvering a damaged chair toward the freight elevator, she heard what sounded like papers rustling. Carmen stopped and listened. The courthouse's basement was supposed to be empty at night, secured by multiple locked doors that only senior staff had keys to access. But there it was again, the sound of someone going through documents, pages being turned, files being moved around. She followed the sound deeper into the storage area, past rows of evidence boxes that reached from floor to ceiling. The rustling was coming from the section marked 1987 to 1989. Cases from over 30 years ago. As Carmen rounded the corner, she expected to find someone working late. Maybe a lawyer or investigator who had permission to access old files. Instead, she found the aisle empty, but papers were scattered across the floor as if someone had been hurriedly searching through boxes. Carmen cleaned up the mess, assuming maybe a box had fallen or been improperly stacked. But the next night, she heard the sounds again. This time, they were coming from a different section. Cases from the early 1990s. Night after night, the pattern continued. Carmen would hear someone going through files, always in different sections, always with the same urgent, searching quality. But whenever she investigated, she found only scattered papers and no sign of who might have been looking through them. Carmen started paying closer attention to which sections were being disturbed. She began to notice a pattern. The phantom searcher seemed to be working chronologically backward through the decades, as if looking for something specific from a particular time period. After 2 weeks of this, Carmen decided to stay hidden and actually observe what was happening. She positioned herself behind a large filing cabinet in the 1985-1987 section, where the sounds had been most active recently, and waited. Around 2:30 a.m., she heard footsteps approaching. Slow, deliberate steps that echoed off the concrete floor. Carmen held her breath and peered around the corner of the filing cabinet. What she saw made her blood freeze. A man in an old-fashioned suit was methodically going through evidence boxes, his movements ghostly and translucent. She could see right through him to the shelving units behind. But what terrified her most was his condition. The left side of his head was caved in, dark with what looked like dried blood. The man was examining documents with intense concentration, occasionally making frustrated sounds when he didn't find what he was looking for. He moved with purpose, clearly searching for something specific among the thousands of case files. Carmen watched, too frightened to move, as the ghostly figure worked his way through box after box. Finally, in a file marked People v. Morrison, 1986, he found what he was looking for. He pulled out a manila folder and opened it, his translucent face showing what looked like relief. Inside the folder were photographs, crime scene photos, and as the ghost held them up to examine them, Carmen could see what they showed: a man lying in a pool of blood, the left side of his head destroyed by what looked like a baseball bat. The ghost was looking at pictures of his own murder. Carmen must have made a sound, because suddenly the figure looked directly at her. His eyes were desperate, pleading. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he pointed at the photos, then at himself, then back at the photos. Then he began to fade, growing more translucent until he disappeared entirely, leaving only the scattered papers on the floor. Carmen rushed to the Morrison file and gathered up the photographs and documents. The case summary told a story she found heartbreaking. David Chun, age 34, had been found murdered in his apartment in March 1986. His roommate, Kevin Morrison, had been charged with the crime but acquitted due to insufficient evidence. According to the file, the prosecution's case had fallen apart when key evidence went missing during the trial. A witness who had seen Morrison returning to the apartment on the night of the murder had recanted his testimony. Critical forensic evidence had been mishandled by the lab. David Chun's family had been devastated by the acquittal. They believed Morrison was guilty but had no way to prove it. The case had remained officially unsolved, though everyone involved knew who the killer was. Carmen spent the rest of her shift reading through the entire file. She learned that David Chun had been an accountant who had discovered financial irregularities at the firm where he worked. He'd been scheduled to meet with federal investigators the week after his murder. The missing evidence that had derailed the prosecution included Chun's personal computer, which had contained financial records that would have exposed a major embezzlement scheme. The computer had vanished from the police evidence room, and without it, prosecutors couldn't establish a motive for Morrison to kill his roommate. The next night, Carmen returned to the basement earlier than usual. She wanted to see if David Chun would appear again, to understand what he was trying to communicate. She didn't have to wait long. The ghost materialized near the Morrison file around 2 a.m., just as translucent as before. This time, Carmen spoke to him. "David, is that your name?" The figure nodded, his ghostly form shimmering. "You want people to know the truth about what happened to you." Again, he nodded. Then he pointed at the file, then at himself, then made a gesture toward the upper floors of the courthouse. Carmen understood. David Chun was stuck here, unable to rest until justice was served. He'd been searching through decades of evidence, looking for his own case file, hoping someone would find the truth he'd been denied in life. The next morning, Carmen called the district attorney's office. She told them she was a courthouse employee who had been reviewing old cold cases and had found some irregularities in the Morrison file that might warrant a fresh investigation. What followed was a months-long investigation that revealed Morrison had indeed murdered David Chun to cover up his embezzlement scheme. Morrison had stolen nearly $200,000 from their shared accounting firm and knew Chun was about to expose him. The missing computer was found in Morrison's storage unit, where it had been hidden for over 30 years. Modern forensic techniques were able to recover the deleted financial files that proved both the embezzlement and Morrison's motive for murder. Morrison, now in his 60s and suffering from dementia, confessed to the crime when presented with the evidence. He died in custody before he could be sentenced, but his confession brought closure to David Chun's family and officially solved a case that had haunted them for decades. Carmen never saw David Chun's ghost again after Morrison's arrest. The basement storage area returned to its normal quiet state, with no more phantom searching or scattered papers. She believes David finally found the piece that had eluded him for over 30 years. But Carmen has developed a new appreciation for her work in the courthouse. She understands now that the building holds more than just legal proceedings and paperwork. It holds the hopes and frustrations of everyone who has sought justice within its walls. And sometimes those hopes are so strong, they can reach beyond death itself. Story 3. The jury box. Thomas Bright had been cleaning the Hennepin County Government Center for 8 years when he first encountered the phantom jury. The massive modernist building housed multiple courtrooms, administrative offices, and holding facilities. And Thomas's route took him through different sections each night. Courtroom 1856 was one of the larger venues. used for high-profile cases that drew significant media attention and public interest. The jury box could seat 16 people, and during major trials, every seat would be filled with citizens called to serve their civic duty. Thomas had always found something unsettling about Courtroom 1856, even when it was empty. The room had been the site of several notorious trials over the years, including murder cases, corruption scandals, and civil rights violations that had made national news. It was during the winter of his 8th year that Thomas first noticed the jury box wasn't empty when he arrived for his nightly cleaning. As he entered the courtroom around midnight, he saw figures sitting in the jury seats, their forms dim and translucent in the emergency lighting. Thomas thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He'd been working long hours lately, picking up extra shifts to help pay for his daughter's college tuition. Fatigue could cause hallucinations, he reasoned. But when he turned on the overhead lights, the figures didn't disappear. If anything, they became clearer. 12 people sat in the jury box, men and women of various ages, all wearing clothing from different eras. Some were dressed in suits from the 1980s, others in more modern attire, and a few wore styles that looked like they were from the 1970s. What struck Thomas most was their expressions. They all looked deeply troubled, their ghostly faces etched with anguish and uncertainty. They were talking among themselves in whispers too low for him to understand, but their body language suggested intense disagreement. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to flee or investigate. The phantom seemed unaware of his presence, completely absorbed in their heated discussion. One elderly man was gesticulating emphatically, while a middle-aged woman shook her head in apparent disgust. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. The ghostly jurors immediately fell silent and turned to look at him. Their eyes held a mixture of desperation and hope, as if they'd been waiting for someone to acknowledge their presence. "Excuse me," Thomas said, his voice shaky. Are you supposed to be here?" One of the jurors, a woman in her 50s wearing a navy blue dress that looked like it was from the early 1990s, spoke for the group. "We can't reach a verdict," she said, her voice carrying the weight of profound frustration. "We've been deliberating for years, and we can't agree. The evidence is complicated." Thomas realized he was talking to the spirits of jurors from past trials. These were people who had served in this very courtroom, and something about their experience had been so traumatic, so unresolved, that they'd been unable to move on even after death. "What case are you deliberating?" Thomas asked. The woman looked at her fellow jurors before answering. "People v. Richardson, 1993, a police officer accused of shooting an unarmed teenager. We couldn't decide if it was justified or murder." Thomas remembered the case vaguely. It had been a controversial trial that had divided the community along racial lines. Officer James Richardson had shot 17-year-old Marcus Williams during what Richardson claimed was a traffic stop that turned violent. Williams's family and community activists argued it was an unprovoked killing motivated by racism. "The evidence was contradictory," another juror said. "An older black man wearing a suit from the 1990s, the prosecutor said. "Richardson planted the gun we found near the body." The defense said Williams was reaching for it when Richardson fired. The forensic evidence was inconclusive, added a young woman who looked like she might have been in her 20s during the trial. No fingerprints on the weapon. Conflicting witness testimonies. "We spent weeks going over every piece of evidence, and half of us thought he was guilty, half thought he was innocent." Thomas understood their dilemma. In criminal cases, the jury had to be unanimous. If they couldn't reach agreement, it would result in a hung jury and a mistrial. The case would likely be retried with a new jury. "What happened?" Thomas asked. "Did you reach a verdict?" The elderly man who had been gesticulating earlier spoke up. "We compromised. Found him guilty of manslaughter instead of murder. It felt like a betrayal to everyone. The victim's family wanted murder. The officer's family wanted acquittal. We chose the middle ground because we couldn't live with either extreme. But we never stopped wondering if we got it right. The woman in the navy dress said, "Richardson served 8 years and was released. Williams is still dead. Did we deliver justice or did we fail everyone involved?" Thomas set down his cleaning supplies and sat in one of the gallery chairs. Sensing that these spirits needed someone to listen to their decades-old struggle, every night we gather here and go over the evidence again. Another juror explained, a man in his 40s wearing a plaid shirt. Looking for something we missed, some detail that would have made the decision clear. But it never gets easier. We've seen other juries come and go, the young woman added. Other difficult cases, other impossible decisions. But they reach their verdicts and move on. We're stuck because we compromised instead of truly deciding. Thomas listened as each juror shared their perspective on the case. Some still believed Richardson was guilty of murder, but had voted for manslaughter to avoid a hung jury. Others thought the shooting was justified, but had compromised to reach consensus. None of them were fully satisfied with the verdict they'd rendered. "What if I told you that you did the right thing?" Thomas said after hearing their stories. What if the evidence really was impossible to interpret with certainty, and a compromise verdict was the most honest response to an ambiguous situation? The jury members looked at each other with surprise. They'd spent 30 years second-guessing themselves, assuming that their inability to reach a definitive verdict represented a failure of justice rather than a response to a genuinely unclear case. Sometimes, Thomas continued, the truth is messy. Sometimes there isn't enough evidence to be completely certain, and the best a jury can do is make their most honest assessment based on what they have. You did that. Over the next several nights, Thomas would find the phantom jury in session, and he'd join their discussions. He'd researched the Richardson case and learned that subsequent investigations had never definitively resolved the questions the jury had struggled with. The case remained controversial, with legitimate arguments on both sides. Thomas also learned that Officer Richardson had never been involved in another shooting after his release from prison. He'd left law enforcement and had become an advocate for police reform, working to prevent the kind of tragic encounter that had cost Marcus Williams his life. Maybe your verdict did serve justice, Thomas told the ghostly jurors. Richardson was held accountable for his actions but wasn't destroyed by them. He was able to learn and grow and contribute something positive. The elderly man who had been the most agitated when Thomas first encountered them seemed to consider this. We thought we had failed because we couldn't be certain. But perhaps certainty wasn't possible, and we did the best we could with impossible circumstances. One by one, the phantom jurors began to nod in agreement. They'd spent 3 decades torturing themselves over a decision that might have been the most just outcome possible given the evidence they had to work with. "Thank you," the woman in the navy dress said to Thomas. "Thank you for helping us understand that justice isn't always about absolute certainty. Sometimes it's about doing your best with what you have, and accepting that some situations don't have perfect answers." The next night, when Thomas entered courtroom 1856, the jury box was empty. The phantom jurors had finally reached the peace they'd been seeking for 30 years. They'd realized that their compromise verdict hadn't been a failure of justice, but rather justice operating under difficult circumstances. Thomas continues his work at the courthouse, but he carries with him the lesson the phantom jury taught him. Justice isn't always about clear-cut answers or satisfying everyone involved. Sometimes the most just outcome is the one that acknowledges uncertainty while still holding people accountable for their actions. Story 4. The Sentencing Chamber. Angela Price had been cleaning the Pierce County Superior Court for 2 years when she first encountered Judge Eleanor Whitfield. The problem was, Judge Whitfield had been dead for 15 years. The Tacoma Courthouse was a blend of old and new construction, with the original 1950s building connected to a modern addition built in the 1990s, Judge Whitfield's old courtroom. Number 7 was in the older section and hadn't been used for regular proceedings. Since her retirement in 2007, Angela's supervisor had warned her that Courtroom 7 required special attention. It was sometimes used for overflow cases or special hearings, so it needed to be maintained even though it wasn't in daily use. The room had a different feel from the modern courtrooms, with dark wood paneling and traditional fixtures that gave it a more formal, intimidating atmosphere. Judge Whitfield had been known as the Iron Lady during her 25-year career on the bench. She was famous for her harsh sentences, particularly in violent crime cases. Defense attorneys dreaded appearing before her, knowing that she rarely showed mercy and never deviated from the maximum allowed penalties. Angela first saw the judge on a Thursday night in November. She'd entered Courtroom 7 around 1 a.m. to dust the furniture and mop the floors when she noticed someone sitting behind the judge's bench. For a moment, Angela thought maybe a real judge was working late, reviewing cases or preparing for the next day's docket. But as she looked closer, she realized the figure was translucent, shimmering like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The ghost of Judge Whitfield sat in her old chair, wearing her black robes, reading from a file that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Angela stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to retreat or stay. The phantom judge looked up from her reading and made eye contact, her expression stern but not unkind. "Come in, my dear," Judge Whitfield said, her voice carrying the authority it had possessed in life. "I could use some company while I review these cases." Angela cautiously entered the courtroom, her cleaning cart squeaking on the old linoleum floor. You're Judge Whitfield, aren't you?" "I am. And you must be one of the night cleaning staff. I've seen you around the building." The ghost smiled, an expression that seemed foreign on her famously stern face. "Please don't be afraid. I'm not here to cause trouble, but you single quotes single struggled to find the right words. Dead?" "Yes, I am. 5 years now. Heart attack in my sleep, which was probably more merciful than I deserved." Judge Whitfield set down the glowing file and folded her hands. "I'm here because I have unfinished business. Cases I need to reconsider." Angela set down her cleaning supplies and sat in one of the gallery chairs. "What kind of cases?" Judge Whitfield gestured to the files scattered across her bench. "Every harsh sentence I handed down. Every time I chose punishment over rehabilitation. Every young person I sent to prison when I could have offered alternatives." Her voice carried deep regret. "I thought I was serving justice, but I'm beginning to understand that justice and vengeance aren't the same thing." She picked up one of the glowing files. "Take this case. Michael Torres, age 19. First-time offender caught with 2 grams of cocaine. I gave him 3 years because I wanted to make an example. He came out of prison addicted to heroin, committed armed robbery to feed his addiction, and died of an overdose at 24. You couldn't have known what would happen." Angela said gently, "But I could have chosen differently. Drug treatment instead of prison. Community service instead of incarceration. I had options, and I consistently chose the harshest one available." Judge Whitfield opened another file. "Here's another. Sarah Kim, age 22. Stole $300 from her employer because her daughter needed medical treatment and she couldn't afford it. I sentenced her to 18 months, knowing she would lose her job, her apartment, and custody of her child." Angela listened as the phantom judge recounted case after case where her rigid adherence to maximum sentences had destroyed lives rather than delivering justice. Young people sent to adult prisons where they learned more about crime than rehabilitation. First-time offenders given penalties that ensured they would become career criminals. Families broken apart by sentences that prioritized punishment over healing. "Why are you showing me this?" Angela asked. "Because I need someone to understand. I need someone to know that I realize how wrong I was." Judge Whitfield's ghostly form shimmered with what looked like tears. I spent my career believing that harsh sentences would deter crime, that punishment would somehow fix broken people. Instead, I created more victims and more criminals. Over the next several weeks, Angela would find Judge Whitfield in Courtroom 7 whenever she worked the late shift. Each night, the phantom judge would share more stories of sentences she regretted, lives she believed she had ruined through her inflexibility. Angela began to research the cases Judge Whitfield mentioned. What she discovered was more complex than the ghost's self-recrimination suggested. Yes, some of the people Judge Whitfield had sentenced harshly had gone on to commit more serious crimes. But others had been genuinely deterred by their experiences and had gone on to lead productive lives. "Judge," Angela said one night, "I looked up Marcus Thompson. You gave him 5 years for burglary when he was 20. He served 3 years, got his GED in prison, and used a trade program to become an electrician. He's been clean for 12 years now and runs his own business." Judge Whitfield looked surprised. "Marcus Thompson? I remember his case. I thought the prison sentence would destroy him. Maybe some people needed the structure that prison provided. Maybe some of your sentences did serve justice, even if they seemed harsh at the time." Angela continued her research and shared more success stories with the phantom judge. People who had used their time in prison to get education, treatment, or job training. People who had been deterred from further crime by the severity of their sentences. People who had found purpose and meaning despite, or perhaps because of, the consequences Judge Whitfield had imposed. "You're trying to tell me that I wasn't always wrong," Judge Whitfield said one night. "I'm trying to tell you that justice is complicated. Sometimes harsh sentences are wrong. Sometimes they're necessary. You made decisions based on the information you had in the legal framework you were working within." Angela had also learned that Judge Whitfield's reputation for harshness had been somewhat exaggerated. While she did impose maximum sentences in violent crimes, her record showed she had also frequently ordered treatment programs, reduced charges for cooperation, and worked with probation departments to find alternatives to incarceration for appropriate cases. The media focused on your toughest sentences because those made good stories. But you also showed mercy when it was appropriate. You just didn't publicize those decisions. Judge Whitfield spent several nights reviewing the full scope of her judicial career, rather than focusing only on the cases that haunted her. She began to see that her legacy was more nuanced than she had believed. "I think I understand now," the phantom judge said during what would be their last conversation. "I was so focused on the people I might have failed that I lost sight of the people I might have helped. Justice isn't about being universally compassionate or universally stern. It's about finding the right response for each individual case." You served on the bench for 25 years and handled thousands of cases. Some of your decisions were probably wrong, but many others were exactly what justice required. Judge Whitfield smiled, the same warm expression Angela had come to associate with their late-night conversations. "Thank you for helping me see the complete picture rather than just the parts that tormented me." The next night, Courtroom 7 was empty when Angela arrived for her cleaning duties. Judge Whitfield had found the peace that had eluded her for 15 years. Finally able to accept that her judicial career, like all human endeavors, had been a mixture of successes and failures. Wisdom and mistakes. Angela still cleans Courtroom 7, but she approaches the work differently now. She understands that the courtroom has witnessed countless moments of justice being sought, delivered, and sometimes missed. But she also knows that the pursuit of justice, even when imperfect, is a noble calling that deserves respect and understanding. Story 5. The Archives. Roberto Mendez discovered the phantom clerk during his second month working at the Los Angeles County Superior Court's Central Records Facility. The massive basement archive housed over a century of legal documents, from handwritten case files dating back to the 1890s to modern, digital storage systems that backed up every current proceeding. Roberto's job was to maintain the physical archives, ensuring that historical documents were properly preserved and that the climate control systems kept humidity and temperature at optimal levels. The work was solitary and methodical, requiring attention to detail and respect for the historical significance of the materials. The archives were organized chronologically, with the oldest records stored in the deepest sections of the basement. The pre-1950 files were kept in a specially controlled environment, behind multiple security doors that required special clearance to access. Roberto had that clearance because part of his job involved checking these older sections for signs of deterioration or pest damage. It was during one of these routine inspections that Roberto first encountered Harold Fitzgerald. Roberto was examining a section of files from the 1920s when he noticed someone hunched over a desk in the reading area, carefully transcribing information from what looked like very old documents. Roberto's first thought was that someone had unauthorized access to the archives. The basement was supposed to be empty during the overnight shift, and anyone wanting to research historical cases had to schedule appointments during regular business hours. "Excuse me," Roberto called out as he approached the figure. "The archives are closed. You'll need to come back during regular hours." The man looked up from his work, and Roberto immediately realized he was looking at someone who shouldn't exist. The figure was elderly, wearing a green E-shade and sleeve garters that looked like they belonged in the early 1900s. His clothes were formal but old-fashioned, and his entire form had a translucent, ghostly quality. "Oh, my apologies," the ghost said, adjusting his spectacles. "I'm Harold Fitzgerald, senior records clerk. I was just updating some case summaries that were incorrectly filed. There are quite a few errors in the early documentation that need to be corrected." Roberto stared at the phantom clerk, trying to process what he was seeing. You're dead, aren't you?" Harold chuckled, a sound like rustling paper. "Indeed I am. Died in 1934, influenza. But the work isn't finished, you see. There are so many discrepancies in the filing system, so many cases that were never properly documented. I can't rest while the archives are in such disarray." Roberto looked at the documents Harold was working with. They were genuine historical files, some over 100 years old, but they were arranged and annotated in ways that didn't match the current filing system. "What kind of discrepancies?" Roberto asked, his professional curiosity overcoming his fear. Harold gestured to the papers spread across his desk. "Misfilings, primarily. Cases that were filed under wrong names or dates. Summary judgments that were never properly recorded. Appeals that were noted in one file but not cross-referenced in the related cases." He picked up a manila folder that seemed to glow with the same ethereal light Roberto had noticed around other ghostly evidence. "Take this case, People v. Morrison, 1923. The original filing clerk spelled the defendant's name wrong in the index, so when his family tried to research the case years later, they couldn't find any record of the trial. That happens sometimes," Roberto said. "Clerical errors are part of working with historical documents, but this wasn't just a clerical error," Harold explained. "Morrison was executed for a murder he didn't commit. The real killer confessed 3 years later, but because Morrison's case file was misfiled, nobody could locate the documentation needed to posthumously clear his name. His family spent decades believing their father was a murderer." Roberto felt a chill that had nothing to do with the archive's climate control system. "How many cases like this are there?" Harold's ghostly face grew grave. "Hundreds, maybe thousands. The early filing systems were inconsistent. Clerks made mistakes under pressure, and some records were deliberately misfiled to cover up corruption or incompetence." Over the next several weeks, Roberto would find Harold working in the archives whenever he did his late-night rounds. The phantom clerk seemed to have unlimited time and perfect memory for the filing systems used throughout the courthouse's history. Harold showed Roberto cases where innocent people had been wrongly convicted, but the appeals process had failed due to missing documentation. Cases where guilty parties had escaped justice because key evidence files had been misfiled or lost. Cases where families had been denied closure because the paperwork documenting their loved ones' deaths had been incorrectly archived. "I've been working on this for 90 years, Harold said one night, trying to correct the errors, restore the missing connections, ensure that every case has a complete and accurate record. Why is this so important to you?" Roberto asked. "Because these aren't just files," Harold replied, gesturing to the endless rows of documents. "Each one represents a human life, a moment when someone sought justice or was denied it. When we file them incorrectly or lose them entirely, we're erasing part of someone's story." Roberto began working with Harold, learning the intricacies of the historical filing systems and helping to identify discrepancies that the phantom clerk had discovered. They developed a system where Roberto would make the physical corrections during his official work hours, while Harold would identify the problems during his ghostly research. Through their collaboration, they corrected hundreds of misfiled cases, reunited separated documents that belonged to the same proceedings, and created cross-references that made historical research far more accurate and complete. Roberto also helped Harold understand that some of the errors he'd been trying to correct were actually intentional decisions made by later archivists who had reorganized the filing systems to improve efficiency and accessibility. "Your original filing system made sense for the 1920s, Roberto explained, but as the volume of cases increased, archivists had to develop new organizational methods. Some of what you see as mistakes are actually improvements." Harold studied the modern filing protocols and began to appreciate how the systems had evolved to serve users better. "I suppose I was so focused on preserving the old methods that I couldn't see the benefits of the new ones." Roberto suggested they focus their efforts on genuinely lost or misfiled cases, rather than trying to restore obsolete filing systems. This targeted approach allowed them to make real progress on reuniting families with documentation they needed and correcting historical records that contained factual errors, their most significant discovery was a cache of files from the 1940s that had been stored in the wrong section for over 70 years. These documents contained evidence that exonerated several people who had been wrongly convicted of crimes during World War II, many of whom had been targeted due to their ethnic backgrounds. Roberto worked with the court's legal staff to review these cases and contact the families of the wrongly convicted. While the original defendants had long since died, their descendants were finally able to clear their relatives' names and understand the truth about their family histories. "This is what I was meant to accomplish," Harold said as they completed the restoration of the wartime files. "Not perfect filing systems, but perfect justice for those who were denied it." Harold began to appear less frequently after that, and when Roberto did see him, the phantom clerk seemed more at peace. He'd accomplished his mission of ensuring that the courthouse's historical records truly served their purpose of preserving justice rather than obscuring it. "Thank you," Harold said during their final conversation. "Thank you for helping me understand that archives serve people, not the other way around." Roberto never saw Harold again after that night, but he continues their work of maintaining and improving the historical archives. He's developed new indexing systems that make historical case research more accessible and has trained other staff to identify and correct the kinds of errors that had trapped Harold's spirit for nearly a century. Roberto has come to understand that his work in the archives is more than just document preservation. He's maintaining a record of how justice has been sought, delivered, and sometimes denied throughout the courthouse's history. And sometimes correcting those records can deliver justice that was long delayed but never abandoned.